Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending our second installment of our Women's History Month celebration. As a reminder, our theme this year is empowerment, and each of our featured speakers is a leader at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. We had the pleasure of kicking our month off discussing the invisible labor of working moms last week with Director Meck, and today we have a poignant topic being offered by one of our amazing hearing examiners, Tamara Shehadeh-Cope. But before we begin our program officially, I'd like to invite our Executive Director for a few welcoming remarks. Edie?
Thank you, Director Chang. Happy Women's History Month to all of the amazing external and internal social change agents that make up our Commonwealth and elsewhere. It was very intentional for us here at the PHRC 3 years ago to not just highlight a woman leader just for the month of March, but for each week in the month of March. And so this is our third year in doing.
Edie, you were muted somehow. I'm not sure what happened there.
I am so sorry. How about that? Because I did take myself off of mute and then it got muted. Okay, I just want to briefly bring welcome to everyone. We are excited for this second installment of Women's History Month with an amazing social change agent here at the PHRC. It was very intentional 3 years ago for us not to just highlight a woman leader for the month of March, just one. We, in fact, 3 years ago, embarked upon doing a woman leader, woman speaker each week in the month of March. And so this is our third year in doing this. I don't like using terms like I'm a Black male feminist, but I am a person that does believe in the leadership of women and the tradition of Fannie Lou Hamer, Ida B. Wells, Dorothy Day, so many individuals, the women in my family, both of my grandmothers who were domestic workers. And so in that spirit, we're excited about what's about to be on display today. The other thing that I want to share with all of us is that for those who are not able to be in this space, our Director of Communication, Director Brothman, does a superb job of making sure that we send the link out afterwards. So if you're not able to view it in its entirety today, it lives forever on our PHRC YouTube station. Lastly, I want to say, not just for our speakers, but for everyone that is pushing the social justice needle forward in this moment. It's a very interesting moment, a very challenging moment, very peculiar moment. Just continue to soar for justice, and looking forward to this presentation. And once again, welcome and greetings to everyone.
Thank you so much, Edie Lassiter. I am eager to hand the program over to Tamara Shehadeh-Cope, but before I do, I have to share her powerful bio with the audience. So if you will indulge me one moment. Tamara Shehadeh-Cope, Esquire, comes to the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission with a passion for human rights advocacy and furthering social justice causes. Shehadeh-Cope has dedicated much of her career to the practice of immigration law and serving particularly vulnerable non-citizens throughout the Commonwealth. She has worked diligently to provide trauma-informed advocacy to crime victims and to facilitate access to free legal services, both of which are very important to her. Prior to joining the PHRC, Shehadeh-Cope worked at Pennsylvania Immigration Resource Center, otherwise known as PHRC, in various capacities. In her role as supervising attorney for PHRC's community programs, Shehadeh-Cope represented undocumented and non-citizen survivors of domestic violence, human trafficking, and similar crimes before the United States Citizenship and Immigrant Service, otherwise known as USCIS, and the Executive Office of Immigration Review, also known as EOIR. She worked closely with clients in obtaining legal relief under the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, and the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act, while supervising a team of attorneys and Department of Justice accredited representatives doing the same work. Additionally, Shehadeh-Cope worked as a staff attorney with the Removal Defense Program, where she provided Know Your Rights presentations and information to detained immigrants throughout the Commonwealth as part of the Legal Orientation Program at the Department of Justice. Through her work in removal defense, Shehadeh-Cope successfully represented many asylum seekers and non-citizen detainees in immigration court. Shehadeh-Cope also worked as managing immigration attorney at Community Justice Project, CJP, a part of the Pennsylvania Legal Aid Network, also referred to as PLAN, where she served immigrant domestic violence survivors in their immigration cases before USCIS and EOIR. Shehadeh-Cope engaged in extensive outreach, connecting with domestic violence shelters and service providers throughout Commonwealth to provide educational trainings to staff and communities. And Fordham University, Shehadeh-Cope has contributed to the PHRC's continuing work towards a diverse, just, and inclusive Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And so it is my esteemed pleasure to turn the program over to our featured speaker, Tamara Shehadeh-Cope.
Wow, thank you so much, Director Chang, for the warm welcome, and thank you to Edie Lassiter and to Director Rothman as well. So thanks everyone for being here with me today. If you'll just indulge me one moment, I'll pull up the presentation. Okay, can everyone see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great, excellent. So wonderful. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. So when I was invited to partake in our Women's History Month lecture series, I immediately knew that I wanted to present on global women's rights issues. One, because we recently celebrated International Women's Day on March 8th, so happy International Women's Day. And I recalled my work with immigrant and refugee women who are unshakable pillars of strength for their families and their communities. But most of all, because much of what I'll discuss today highlights, but is not limited to, the immigrant experience. Women's rights issues and the reasons that women migrate are universal issues, and the desire for safety and stability for oneself and one's family are universal, as are the lengths that one would be willing to go in order to ensure a brighter future for those they love. So, although my focus today is international, as I transition through these slides, I invite everyone to think about how our struggles and our victories are interconnected. So I wanted to start off with a bit of a roadmap of where we're heading today and the questions we'll seek to answer. So we're going to be looking at some of the key global rights, women's rights issues that drive migration patterns of women and children. I'll provide a brief overview of international protections under international law, as well as a brief overview of the U.S. immigration system. We'll also touch on some barriers that are faced by immigrant women in accessing services here in the United States, how we can show up for each other in a way that accounts for lived experience and promotes safety and understanding. And finally, I'd love to just highlight a few state and local organizations doing the work here in Pennsylvania. Before I continue, I also wanted to note a few things. Much of my focus today will be on immigration as a form of humanitarian relief, but I will also briefly provide an overview of how someone who is not a refugee or an asylee might be able to come to the U.S. I'll also refrain from focusing on recent immigration law and policy developments, except when necessary and relevant. I do this because this is an area that, as we know, is constantly changing, so my overview of the system will be more general. Finally, and very importantly, I want to state that the lived experiences of immigrants in the United States do not begin and end with their interaction with enforcement and deportation officials and regimes, despite the dominance of these issues in our political rhetoric. The immigrant community, just as the native-born population, is incredibly diverse in its languages, ethnicities, races, faiths, and so on. And the community is also diverse in the ways that individuals arrive to the U.S. and their motivations for coming to the U.S., in their current immigration statuses, as well as in the levels of socioeconomic stability here in the U.S. So I just wanted to put that out there before I get started. That said, let's turn to a few key global women's rights issues. Women, as we know, are entitled to enjoy the same human rights and fundamental freedoms of other individuals. However, they are faced with international universal problems that occur in all societies, cultures, and communities, including our own. My focus today, as I said, is international, but this doesn't mean that we in the US do not engage in many of the same behaviors. Some of the most harmful and prevalent abuses occur in the following areas. So gender-based violence or violence against women. So per the UN General Assembly, in their resolution and the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, violence against women has been defined to include any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or mental harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion, or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or private life. That distinction of public versus private life, a little later we'll talk a bit about asylum, but that's been an important distinction, especially for women who are survivors of domestic violence seeking asylum here in the United States. Violence includes but is not limited to sexual violence in conflict zones, genital mutilation, and domestic violence. So with sexual and reproductive health are critical to a woman's overall health and well-being, and under international human rights law, states have an obligation to ensure that women have access to comprehensive reproductive health care services. Barriers that prevent equal access to health care for women include high costs for services, a requirement for preliminary authorization by a spouse, parent, or hospital authorities, and distance from facilities coupled by a lack of convenient and affordable public transport. With political and civil participation, women have an equal right to participate in a political and civil society. Yet women face a number of barriers, such as unequal access to education and the opportunities that come with it. Women also face underrepresentation in legislative bodies and political leadership. Marriage and family. Under international law, a woman has the right to choose whether, when, and whom to marry. This includes arranged marriages, where an arranged marriage can still happen, but of course, the woman has to consent to such a marriage. However, women around the world face forced marriages, child marriages, or their marital status is used to restrict their exercise of other human rights, such as political participation or property ownership based on that marital or family status. Human trafficking. As we know, human trafficking is a global problem that disproportionately affects women and girls, and victims of human trafficking often suffer from sexual violence and other severe violations of their human rights. Labor and employment. Women have the right to fair wages, adequate working conditions, and employment without discrimination under international law. Men and women are equally entitled to work. Men and women are equally entitled to work, employment opportunities, choice of profession, equal salary and wages, among other things. But as we know, this isn't quite the way it plays out for women. Property. Women also have the right to administer property and to enjoy property rights equal to those of a male spouse under law. But as noted under the marriage and family section, sometimes their property rights are restricted based on their marital status. So what causes these issues? Amnesty International, for one, identified some of the root causes as being harmful gender norms and stereotypes that have a disproportionate impact on girls, as well as this idea of dominance. Basically, it's this perception that women are inferior to men that justifies male dominance, authority, and control over women. Women are also often blamed for the very violence that they have been subject to. What comes out of this are a number of implications that span many areas of a woman's life. As far as legislative implications, ineffective legislation and jurisdiction over cases involving violence against women specifically, makes it more unlikely that perpetrators are prosecuted and punished. The expectation of impunity may actually encourage individuals to commit violence, and it denies survivors justice. And what impunity essentially is, when we talk about impunity, it's the failure to bring perpetrators of human rights violations to justice, whether at an individual level or at an institutional level. And under international law, impunity constitutes a denial of a victim's right to justice and redress. And so we might see this in countries that suffer from pervasive corruption, for example, or where the judiciary is weak or corrupt. And as you'll see later, the idea of impunity is also closely connected to our right to asylum. Societal implications. The unchallenged prevalence of harmful gender norms and stereotypes in society, it in effect normalizes mistreatment of women and girls, it legitimizes the behavior of perpetrators, and it exacerbates gender inequalities that makes it difficult for anyone to speak up. Individual implications. So individual perpetrators of gender-based violence, for example, they're motivated by maintaining a gender order that is based on inequalities and hierarchies, which maintain and reinforce male privilege. And not just male privilege, right? Certain groups of women suffer multiple discriminations due to their membership in multiple minority groups. We know that. We see those intersections. In addition to being subjected to gender discrimination, some women may be more likely to experience human rights violations if they belong to a racial or ethnic minority, indigenous or rural community, or if they're migrants, children, poor, imprisoned, disabled, or elderly. For example, the UN Office of the Special Advisor on Gender Issues has noted that Indigenous women are more likely to lack equal access to education and healthcare and to suffer from poverty, preventable diseases, and maternal mortality at higher rates than non-Indigenous women. So if I'm looking at the Black maternal mortality rates here in the US, which is 2.6 times that of white women, it's clear that this isn't an issue unique to countries outside of our own. I just wanted to highlight that. So there are several international and regional human rights instruments which seek to protect women and girls from gender-based violence. There's the Convention on the Elimination, and these are just a few of many out there, but these are kind of the larger ones, more well-known ones, and I guess relatively recent ones. The Convention on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, or CEDAW, I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce that, but that's how I'm going to say it. Which has been in force since 1981. So CEDAW provides that there should be equal political, economic, social, cultural, and civil rights for women, and it requires member states to enact national legislation banning discrimination. It also addresses the need for equal access in education and non-discriminatory health services for women, including family planning services. Interestingly, special attention is given to the problems faced by rural women, sexual trafficking of women, as well as other sexual exploitation of women. And in 1993, the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, or DEVA, was adopted by the UN General Assembly. DEVA is part of CEDAW, and it was the first international instrument explicitly addressing violence against women and providing a framework for national and international action. Now, states have made multiple reservations to CEDAW, but CEDAW remains the most widely applicable human rights treaty dedicated to women's rights. By the way, for anyone wondering, as I was, international conventions are legally binding agreements that create enforceable obligations, while declarations serve as non-binding statements of intent. I did not know that until I was doing research for today's presentation, but now I know that distinction. Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment, and Eradication of Violence Against Women. This is a regional protection, and it was adopted in 1994. By the way, the US, we are signatories to all of these protections listed. This convention was adopted in 1994 and defines violence against women. It establishes that violence against women constitutes a violation of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and it recognizes that a woman's right to live free from violence includes the right to live free from all forms of discrimination. Finally, on this page, I'll briefly touch on the Beijing Declaration and Platform of Action. So that was adopted in 1995. And as a declaration, as we now know, it's not legally binding, but it has been integral to identifying areas of critical concern and developing an agenda for achieving gender equality. It identified 12 priority topics where action is needed to address gender inequality, and it worked to advance strategic objectives in furtherance of women's right and gender equality. So as I noted here, these international and regional human rights instruments oblige state parties to take appropriate measures to protect women and girls, but implementation is often lacking. So last week, very timely, UN Women released a report looking at where we are 30 years after the Beijing Declaration. And although there seemed to be progress in some areas, overall it was apparent that we have a long way to go to fulfill the hope of the declaration. For example, since Beijing, kind of noting some of the positives. And if you'd like to read the full report, it is available online. Really great, helpful information, a lot of infographics, a lot of great data. I've just picked a few to highlight, but I definitely encourage folks to take a look at the actual report. Since Beijing, 88% of countries have passed laws and established services to eliminate violence against women and girls. 44% are improving the quality of education, training, and lifelong learning for women and girls. And the proportion of women in parliaments has more than doubled since 1995. Great. But even though 88% of countries have passed these laws and established services to eliminate violence, cases of conflict-related sexual violence has risen by 50% since 2002. Women and girls suffer 95% of these crimes. While 44% of the member states are improving the quality of education, 59.5 million adolescent girls lack access to education. And even though we're seeing more women in parliament, almost 3/4 of parliamentarians are still men. And so I also wanted to read kind of this excerpt from the report that I thought was a really accurate depiction of kind of what we're seeing more recently, and kind of highlights the urgency of women's rights issues, and doing something about ensuring safety and stability for all women. So it says here, gender discrimination remains deeply embedded in the structures of economies and societies. This sustains wide and unjust gaps in power and resources, imposing a chronic constraint on progress on women's rights. The weakening of democratic institutions has gone hand in hand with backlash on gender equality. Anti-rights actors are actively undermining long-standing consensus on key women's rights issues. Where they cannot roll back legal and policy gains altogether, they seek to block or slow their implementation. Almost 1/4 of countries reported that backlash on gender equality is hampering implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action. So the report, in addition to kind of giving us a snapshot of where we are now, it also reassessed the priority areas that were outlined in 1995, and it also proposed a number of priorities and initiatives to be met by 2030. So they include the following. Equal access to technology for all women and girls, so bridging the digital gender gap and providing equal access to digital technology, financial services, markets, and networks. 2, investment in social protection programs like women's health, girls' education, and care. Adopting, implementing, and funding legislation to end violence against women and girls and develop national action plans, including support and coordination with community-led organizations to extend the reach of services. 4, promote equal decision-making, power for women in public and private domains, and at all levels of government. Financing gender-responsive humanitarian aid in conflicts and crises by adopting national action plans and funding local women's organizations leading the responses to these conflicts. And 6, climate justice through women's access to green jobs, access to productive assets, and land rights. This is, I think we can all agree, this is all wonderful. However, some girls and women do not have until 2030. Women are navigating violations of their human rights right now and need that access right now. And so when you think about the impacts on women that we discussed earlier, coupled with the issues of impunity that I also discussed, it's easy to see why for some women, immigration, for example, to a country outside of their native country, not just talking about the United States, might be seen as the best path to safety, stability, and opportunity for themselves or for their families, even if they would rather not leave. So let's fill out some forms, hop on a plane, and immigrate. It's easy, right? Wrong. This labyrinth that you see here is I'd say, a fairly accurate representation of our U.S. immigration system. I'll provide a very brief overview in the next slide, but I thought that this flow chart was a good representation of how the system works and why, as you'll see, immigrating to the United States is less like waiting in line, like people love to say, and more like winning the lottery. It's less like waiting in line. So I find that the easiest way to briefly break down our immigration system so that we're not here all day is to look at the concept of intent. Is one's intent to stay permanently in the United States, or is one's intent to come temporarily and return to one's country of origin? So for those with immigrant intent or the intent to reside or remain indefinitely, the ultimate goal is to become a US citizen, right? The more immediate goal is to become a lawful permanent resident, or as some people say, a green card holder, or LPR. That's because the card used to be greener than it is now. It's still a little green, but the name stuck. Without getting kind of too in the weeds, I will just add that lawful permanent residence is in fact not permanent. Folks can still be found deportable even with one, but again, compared to other options, it's definitely a more stable status, if you will. But generally, for those wishing to have that security, you can become a permanent resident either through your immediate family member, through your employment, or through selection in a diversity lottery. So with regards to like the immediate family and employment, this is a two-person process. In other words, you need a petitioner, a US petitioner, who is the person with status in the US, and you need a beneficiary, who is the person seeking status. And only certain people can be petitioners. So for example, I, as a US citizen, I can petition for my spouse, my unmarried child under 21. I can apply for my parent to come and join me in the United States, or obtain status here in the United States. I can also apply for example, my unmarried kid that is 21 or older, or my married child, as well as my siblings. So there are other kind of individuals within that sphere, that familial sphere, that you can apply for, but they will be placed in a lower preference category. So depending on who you're petitioning for, you kind of have a place kind of in the hierarchy here. So let's take the example of me petitioning for my my unmarried child under 21 in the United States. So I took a look at our Department of State's visa bulletin. So every month, our Department of State processes visas, applications for people wanting to come to the US, and they issue this visa bulletin to give us an idea of where they are in the process. When are they taking final action? Which applications are they processing now? So I took a look at our visa bulletin for March 2025. And so if I'm petitioning for my unmarried daughter and she's coming from anywhere other than China, India, Mexico, or the Philippines, and I say that because they have their own kind of spots on the table, their own dates. We, and by we, I say the Department of State, we're taking final action on applications that were filed on or before November 22nd, 2015. So my child, who's hearing about her application now, actually submitted that application 10 years ago, and she's been waiting for 10 years. If you're looking to immigrate from Mexico, for example, like I said, there's kind of a different timetable. Right now, we're taking final applications that were processed on or before November of 2004. Let's say my kid is waiting for 10 years and she decides she wants to get married, which is totally reasonable, right? I mean, depending on when she started the process, right? She might have, life goes on, right? She might have fallen in love and decides, Mom, I'm getting married. Wonderful. You don't keep that same preference category. Now she's a married child of a US citizen. She gets bumped down on the list. And so when I was looking at the visa bulletin for married children, right now we are processing applications that were filed on July 1st, 2010. So it goes down the line. If you're a brother or sister, you've been waiting since 2007. And so I kind of give this example just to note that most people actually, oh yeah, I see the chat. The time frames are really interesting, and really, especially if we're looking at Mexico, China, the Philippines. And now, as we know, there is a backlog in these processes, in these systems. So people are having to wait even longer. But, I kind of talk about this to say that most people actually don't have an avenue to lawfully immigrate, because even if you're fortunate enough to know someone who can petition for you or have an employer who's willing to sponsor you, can you afford the application fee? Right. Are you able to wait for 10 plus years without kind of making significant changes in your life? Do you have a sponsor? Like you need a sponsor who's going to kind of be on the hook financially for you, regardless of whether or not you can afford to make your way in the US yourself. So just saying, if you have that avenue, you're still waiting a while. There's still a lot of challenges with ultimately immigrating to the US lawfully, right? What about someone who has non-immigrant intent? So someone wants to visit temporarily. You can apply for a number of visas, like a tourist visa, a business visa, or a student visa. You have to meet certain eligibility requirements, and you have to apply through the Department of State. You get an interview abroad. And if you pass that interview, you get a visa that will allow you to visit for 6 months or so at a time. A note here is that it is difficult to show non-immigrant intent. I mean, you really just have to show that your connections to your home country are incredibly strong. Maybe you're a student, you're still in school, or you have a business, so on. So it really is pretty discretionary. A lot of people do get denied visas. And so this is just kind of to illustrate the challenges of quote unquote, kind of this lawful immigration. So what if someone is experiencing an urgent humanitarian crisis? The immigration process might look a little different for them. So this is an infographic that I like, that I've used many times. This is from Human Rights First, and it looks generally at how refugees get to the US. I'm going to kind of go back and forth between this slide and the next, because in the next slide, I do kind of talk more in detail about asylees and refugees. So with refugees, there is a difference, and there is a lot of confusion here, because there is the definition of a refugee under international law, and then there is refugee status here in the United States. They're two kind of distinct things. And so I guess I'll talk first about this kind of definition of a refugee. So generally, a refugee is someone who is outside of their country, it's outside of the United States, and who is or who has experienced persecution outside of the United States, and they've been persecuted on account of a protected class. And so under our immigration laws, you have to show that you've been persecuted on account of race, nationality, religion, political opinion, or because you are a member in what's known as a particular social group. So that social group can be a number of things. It's really kind of if you have an immutable characteristic that you can't change or shouldn't have to change, but you're being persecuted. So for example, if you are disabled, if you are gay, just a number of different kind of categories. Familial status might also be down there. And it also includes women who are domestic violence survivors, who are being persecuted. So anyway, you have to kind of fit within this protected class and show you're being persecuted on that basis. You also have to show that the government is the persecutor or is unable or unwilling to control the persecutor. So again, we're talking about impunity here, right? We're talking about, maybe the government isn't the perpetrator of the persecution, but they might not be able to rein in whoever is perpetrating the violence. So that's kind of the general definition of a refugee. And so when we look at refugee status, so we hear about this on the news, right? Someone coming into the United States as a refugee, and you hear about asylees. What's the difference? The difference really lies in where you were at the start of this process. And what I mean, so refugees and asylees technically both fit into that definition of refugees. They've both been persecuted on account of their membership in a particular class, and they've availed themselves of the protection of their government unsuccessfully. But refugees begin their journey outside of the United States. And so they're designated as a refugee abroad. So a refugee who's applying is approved abroad before boarding a plane and resettled into the US. And so I'm going to go back really quickly to this table, arrow A. It kind of shows the refugee resettlement process. And so refugees will then, up until recently, they had access to a number of resettlement agencies who would assist with finding employment and housing and access to anything else that someone might need when they're trying to build a new life. And refugees do have work authorization. They have work permits. There is a pathway to citizenship. First, they can become a lawful permanent resident, and then eventually a U.S. citizen. There is a cap on the number of refugees admitted every year. The executive branch declares it annually. During the Biden administration, it's hovered around 125,000 people annually. With asylees, again, refugees kind of begin their journey outside of the country. Asylees have to be either in the U.S. or at a port of entry, that is, at one of our borders, or at our airports, anywhere where they're seeking admission to the United States. And they have to prove that they meet the definition of a refugee. So an asylee can apply affirmatively and administratively or defensively in court as a form of relief from deportation. So I'll go back to the illustration here, and I'm going to focus on B and C. So sometimes, like I said, if you are in crisis, and you need to leave, and maybe you have the means to apply for a visa and enter the U.S. lawfully, that's wonderful. Or sometimes people have a visa and they're here, but then while they're here, something might have happened in their country of origin and now it's no longer safe to return. So you find yourself applying for asylum. If you do it within 1 year of being here in the United States, you kind of enter this affirmative, while you're here lawfully, you enter this affirmative asylum process. It's all application-based. It's before the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS, and you go in for an interview with an asylum officer, and you may be granted asylum. When we're looking at C and D, this might be someone who requests asylum at the border, for example, and they express a fear of persecution, or maybe at the time they didn't realize that they could have requested asylum, right? They knew they wanted to request it, but maybe they weren't asked. I've also encountered this with folks that I've worked with. But eventually, they do express that fear of persecution and they're entered into proceedings. And that process looks a little different because you are detained in immigration detention. You might be eligible for a bond, or what some folks might know as bail in the criminal system, and you navigate immigration court proceedings, and that's adjudicated by the Department of Justice. So, with asylees, similarly to refugees, if you are granted asylum and you're able to show all these things, you can become a lawful permanent resident after a year, and eventually you can become a U.S. citizen after 5 years. And you can also petition to bring your families over. I mean, it's wonderful. So with asylees, right, you can also petition for immediate family to join you, other forms of relief, so humanitarian forms of relief. I just wanted to highlight here very quickly. These kind of come and go. So TPS, you might have heard of, temporary protected status. That is for individuals who can't return to their country of origin because of a humanitarian crisis or a natural disaster or some other reason. That's something that is at the discretion of the U.S. government and kind of can get renewed, right, over time as necessary. VAWA, that's a protection under the Violence Against Women Act. So this is for individuals who are here in the United States, who were married, who may be undocumented, but married to a U.S. citizen abuser. So this allows someone, remember I talked about kind of this two-person process, someone has to petition for the other person. Congress recognized that that could easily be exploited in an abusive relationship, right? Because the U.S. citizen abuser might hold all the power. And indeed, you would see a lot of individuals threaten immigration enforcement. And so with VAWA, this allows individuals to self-petition. And so they no longer need that petitioner to kind of vouch for them. They're able to, as long as they can show that the abuse happened, they can navigate the process on their own. U visas for individuals who are victims of certain qualifying crimes in the US and who reported it to law enforcement or somehow cooperated in the detection, investigation, prosecution of that crime. T visas form a relief available to victims of human trafficking. So if you were a victim of labor trafficking or sex trafficking in the United States, you may be eligible. SIJS, special immigrant juvenile status for minors who were abused, abandoned, or neglected by one or both parents. And then parole. Sometimes the United States will permit someone to enter on a temporary basis for like an urgent humanitarian reason or a reason that's a significant public benefit. And then finally, just quickly, deferred action. So deferred action, and DACA, I think, is probably the most well-known. So DACA for childhood arrivals, it stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And contrary to what a lot of folks think, it actually isn't a status that someone has. Essentially, with deferred action and with DACA, the US government is saying, we know you're here, we know you don't have technically kind of any status or documentation, but we're not going to remove you. And so when you have DACA, for example, you get work authorization, and that's about it for now, I hope. And it all can also apply to individuals who are stateless. Sometimes individuals navigate the immigration process, and they're not considered a national by any state. So anyway, regardless of how or when someone enters the US, it's easy to imagine that there's a bit of a culture shock and an adjustment period. And for someone seeking services and seeking to build a stable life here in the US, there might be a number of barriers to access that quickly become apparent. What are some of these barriers to stability and access to services here in the US for someone who's from another country? So language access is a huge one, and lack of language appropriate services. Foreign-born individuals often encounter language barriers and struggle to access information necessary to navigate systems in a new country. And individuals might feel stigmatized when not understood and can experience extended wait times to receive services when organizations rely on a limited number of in-house bilingual or multilingual providers for interpretation. Lack of culturally competent services. So beyond language access, cultural competence is another dimension of access for immigrant communities. According to a recent report by the National Immigrant Justice Center, participants in a focus group described experiencing a lack of cultural competence in their interactions with service providers, as well as outright racial bias and discrimination from providers and a larger community. And this might include access to housing, healthcare, and public benefits, which significantly impact one's life. Ineligibility for services. So lack of access to public benefits for low-income individuals, whether undocumented or as a green card holder. So even if you have status, you have a green card, you still are barred in most cases for about a period of 5 years, for a period of time from accessing certain benefits. And it's a significant barrier to access. It's important to note that there are some intersections here with a fear of deportation. So what I mean by that is for mixed status families where parents might be undocumented and children are US citizens, and the US citizen children are eligible for benefits, that fear of deportation might mean that no one is applying for or claiming benefits that they are eligible for. And so this is a kind of something big that I saw, when you see kind of chilling effects. We talk about the chilling effects across the immigrant communities. This is part of it. And I saw this quite a bit in 2017, 2018. For individuals who have experienced trauma as well, access to mental health services, it's already very challenging to access affordable mental health services, and for a lot of immigrants who've experienced trauma on their journeys, that's a big one as well. Fear of deportation or loss of custody, that's self-explanatory. I just wanted to add that for someone who is undocumented, this fear is an added stressor on top of everything else that someone with stable status might be navigating. Lack of community. So lack of community for someone might be lack of access to the information on resources that they might need. It might mean lack of childcare if they have to work or go out of their way to access services. For immigrant survivors, lack of community can mean increased dependence on an abusive spouse and a power imbalance because they have the access and the information that you need. Trauma, fear, and distrust of institutions. This is a big one, especially for individuals seeking asylum here in the US. Many immigrants in this situation experience layers of trauma before encountering you. So trauma and the persecution that they suffered in their home country, the trauma of the journey to the United States, the trauma of incarceration if they were detained, and then maybe traumas that accompany finding one's way in a new country. So if this was someone or being victimized, right, by discrimination or whatnot. So if this was someone whose government institutions failed to protect them in their home country, they might feel the same here. And this is just really important to highlight because when you are a service provider and you are working to establish a foundation of trust with someone, especially if someone is coming to us having experienced a traumatic event in their life, it might take a little longer, right, to get them to open up, but it's just something to be aware of that, this might not be kind of the first or last time that someone is really in a tough place mentally, emotionally, and so on. So, and this can also apply to someone who's here and afraid of deportation as well. Okay, so I know I'm keeping an eye on the clock, so we've got about 2 more slides if you bear with me. But I wanted to take a really quick step back and kind of tie it into last week's event. So last week, my colleague and our wonderful Civil Rights Outreach Director, Cheryl Meck, opened our Women's History Month with an excellent presentation on the invisible labor of the working mom. I invite you to reflect on this presentation and consider how that invisible labor is compounded for mothers who are parenting in a new country with or without stable status, and how fears relating to their national origin or their immigration status adds to that mental load. I also ask us to consider the mental load on a child who navigates a culture outside of the home that is distinct from what welcomes them at the end of the day. The child who might be the primary interpreter of the household, or who's having to learn and navigate systems beyond their years alongside their family members, or the child who is the primary income earner of the household because they might be the only one with work authorization. So whether or not this is fair or the thing to do, that's a conversation for another time, but the fact is that it exists. So the question is, how can we, in the ways that we interact with certain communities, show up for each other? We can't solve the world's problems, we know that, but what we can do is ensure that when someone who is experiencing all of these things, whether in silence or not, is coming to us in our small corner of their world, that we are not contributing to that mental load. How can we, in effect, show up for each other and ensure that we are a place of safety and welcoming? So, I just wanted to put out some tips and best practices for service providers. And I recognize that there may be folks on this call from the PHRC or outside of the PHRC, and feel free to kind of share, any of this or refer folks to me if they're not here on this call but want to kind of know more. Very important, develop and have a language access plan in place. So, per the American Community Survey, which provides annual estimates for the US Census Bureau, over 1.5 million, or approximately 13% of Pennsylvanians, speak a language other than English at home. About over, 600,000, or about 5.2% of individuals reported speaking English less than very well. And this is of the individuals who participated in the census, which, as we know, does not often include individuals who don't want to risk being identified. And what is a language access plan? So for folks who aren't sure or don't know, a language access plan is a document that spells out how to provide services to individuals who are non-English speaking or have limited English proficiency. So language access plans ideally should be tailored to individual organizations. They might include sections such as like needs assessments, language services offered, notices, training for staff, and evaluations. There are a lot of online resources for anyone wanting to create or refresh an existing language access plan. Other things to note with a good language access plan, you want to use qualified interpreters. Again, a lot of times we're guilty of using internal staff that are bilingual and putting that extra work on them, or who aren't trained as qualified interpreters, or asking family members, which is a really big no for a number of reasons. But just, to the extent possible, use qualified interpreters, assess for literacy, and provide written materials in native languages whenever possible as well. In addition to language access plan, you want to discuss confidentiality early and often. So make sure that individuals know that their immigration status or any culturally sensitive information will be kept confidential. For folks working with individuals who may need to file reports, for example, protecting from abuse reports or the like, assist in reporting or provide accompaniment services. That extra step of getting the report to the place it needs to go is a really harrowing and nerve-wracking one for individuals. So to the extent possible, provide those services. Also, for anyone working in victim services, tailor safety planning to the special needs of immigrant victims. What I mean by that, you want to make sure there are copies of documents, maybe provide a quick overview of the U.S. laws and systems. Also, consider constraints when goal setting, particularly with individuals who are in transitional housing, like shelters, or who are generally transient in some area of their life. This is an important one. Dr. Chang, I see your question. I'm going to get to that for sure. This is an important one. Make sure everyone knows and understands their rights. This includes you. This will allow you to better counsel individuals you're serving and put them at ease, but also put you at ease, because if ICE or law enforcement shows up at your office door, you'll know what to do. Practice cultural humility. When providers or agencies fail to recognize cultural differences or make incorrect assumptions based on a lack of awareness of different norms, it leads to inequitable access and discriminatory provision of services. Make warm referrals and ensure that the referral is aware of any language or related needs. And if you're in a situation and positioned to do so, please refer individuals to trusted immigration legal service providers. How about on an individual level? So for all of us, regardless of status, let's just make sure we challenge stereotypes, microaggressions, verbal expressions, and violence when you encounter them. Hold your institutions accountable to implement and honor the international and domestic commitments that we are bound by. And this is a task for everyone. Men and boys have a particular role to play in reaching out to their peers to spread awareness about prevention of gender-based violence and working to change harmful social attitudes, norms, and behaviors. Going back to referrals and legal services providers, this list is by no means exhaustive, but I wanted to honor some of the folks already taking these steps, serving immigrant and refugee women throughout the Commonwealth. I'm happy to connect folks to the extent possible if anyone's interested in learning more. I'm also keeping an eye on the time. I, of course, want to plug the PHRC. So for folks who are outside of the PHRC joining us today, I want to share that the civil rights protections that are afforded to us by the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act are extended to all Pennsylvanians regardless of immigration status. We don't charge for our services. We don't ask for immigration status information or identifying information that could give that away. And we provide interpretation services for anyone who needs it. So if you encounter someone who has been discriminated against based on the listed protected classes, please reach out. And this is a small infographic on my screen, but you can find a copy of this information as well as our contact information at our website at www.pa.gov/agencies/PHRC. So thank you so much for spending your time with me today. I close with this quote: "A strong woman knows she has strength enough for the journey, but a woman of strength knows that it is in the journey where she will become strong." I found it inspirational and a nice way to honor the women who have journeyed across borders or through our lives here in the US. May we always find, see, support, and uplift each other. Thank you.
Well, I will say that was amazing, H.E. Shehadeh-Cope. And so it was so pertinent and so relevant as of late. And so I thank you for choosing a topic that, is, I think, at the forefront of many people's minds, many Americans' minds, due to the last few weeks, but also a passion of yours and an area that you've dedicated your life. And so the passion that you have for the work, it definitely comes through even through your presentation. So I thank you so much for doing that. We did have, I had a comment, but I want to go to the other individual's comment. So Tynetta asked, would you be able to touch on the monetary expense related to applying for entry into the US? And I do apologize if I mispronounced your name, Tynetta.
Sure. Yes. Thank you for that question. I know earlier we talked a little bit about, right, when you're looking generally to apply to enter the US, there are a number of costs associated with that. And it is a really cost prohibitive process. So, even to be considered for entry, you're paying a number of application fees. So you're paying generally, and again, it's been a little while for me, so I don't know the exact application fees. Like, I know that they are pretty high because I worked with a lot of folks on fee waivers. So, but generally you're paying for an application fee, you're paying for a biometrics fee, you're paying for if you require a medical examination before coming to the US or before being granted status, you can only go to certain medical providers, and that's also a couple $100s. Obviously there are renewal fees. So for example, people who have DACA, you have work authorization that's valid for, I want to say 2 years. You're renewing that and you want to renew that every 6 months, like every 6 months before the 2 years are up. And that's a good $500-$600 you're paying on a regular basis. So really, I mean, there is a lot of costs associated with entering the United States, and that isn't including the sponsor that you have to, if you're seeking admission, that you have to kind of find, who also has to have a certain income level. If your sponsor doesn't make enough money, you can have other sponsors kind of join in. But again, it really does, it really is the bottom line, unfortunately, for a lot of these processes.
Thank you. Just scrolling to see lots of comments about loving the presentation. I had put a comment in the chat on slide 11 where you put the differentiation of status and the definition. You mentioned at the top it says refugees, and the general definition is persecuted on the basis of a protected class. I'm just wondering who or what country determines protection, because we know that those protections vary by country.
Oh, yeah. I think that's a great question. I think, kind of in this context, every country, well, there's kind of, right, the international law kind of description. And then the question is, you have a definition, but right, how does it translate into actual status for someone in a specific country? And then to that extent, right, each country kind of has their own, in some countries, like ours, we have a distinction between refugee status and asylee status. Other countries might have the lines blurred a little bit. So I'd say for kind of the purposes of today's presentation, really that's how, when we talk about protected classes, race, religion, political opinion, these are all things that are immigration laws, which stem from international law, right? But we have it codified in our Immigration and Nationality Act. That's how kind of they've interpreted that international definition. So, and again, I think female survivors is a really big one because again, they're not explicitly a protected class. They fit under that particular social group. And there's been a lot of contention, a lot of back and forth in our immigration courts recently about, is this a public or private issue? Is this something that, state governments need to be on the hook for? And with one administration, they're a protected class, with another, they're not. And so it is interesting because really, unfortunately, I don't think it should be the case, but there is sometimes kind of wiggle room, when we're looking at it kind of domestically.
Thank you so much. I know that we are right at the 2:00 mark. Deputy Chief Counsel Williams asked if you can share the slides. I know we are recording the presentation, and so it will be uploaded to the YouTube page if anyone wants to watch the slides as well as listen to the presentation again. And then we can share internally the presentation if H.E. Shehadeh-Cope is amenable to that.
Thank you.
Just reading. Okay. Director Eisler says, thank you for the incredibly empowering presentation. She has so much more information now, and appreciate that you spoke to the understanding of universally women want safety, shelter, and security for their family. Yeah, you had, I have so many notes here that you had mentioned. I appreciated that you brought the information back to US by mentioning the maternal mortality rates. I appreciated that, you made the distinction between international conventions versus declarations. I think that that's incredibly important right now. And really that you opened it with lived experience does not begin or end with the narratives portrayed in the media or outlet sources that we might be seeing at even, higher numbers more recently. So it was phenomenal. Not that I
Awesome.
expected,
Thank
or I
you.
think anybody expected anything less, but it was just so timely. With
Thank you.
that, if there are any other questions, I just want to give a few more minutes. I know, as I said, we're a minute past. I do have a few closing remarks and just reminders for anyone, but I want to hold space for anyone that has any additional questions for H.E. Shehadeh-Cope. Okay, I'm not seeing anything. So as a reminder, we do have weekly features in honor of Women's History Month. And so next week, I have the pleasure of sharing space with our longest reigning commissioner, Dr. Raquel Yanks, to discuss the science of sisterhood, keeping it in line with our theme of empowerment. I want to remind everyone also, again, if you don't already do so, please follow our social media pages. We're on, I believe, all of the platforms at this point to stay abreast of everything that the PHRC is doing as a whole and in our respective divisions. And to echo H.E. Shehadeh-Cope, I just want to thank you all that gave up your lunch hour to share it with us today. I'm sure you took something, if not many somethings, away from H.E. Shehadeh-Cope's presentation, but I do want to say a very, very special thank you to you for agreeing to be featured this month in our series. And it was just fantastic. And so I appreciate it. And the comments already are pouring in with just how amazing it was. So thank you to everyone, and we will see you
Thank you
next
so
week.
much.